This is no longer just another Middle East flare-up. This is a live test of American power, alliance credibility, oil security, and the future of deterrence from Europe to the Persian Gulf. Tonight, the pressure is building on multiple fronts at once. Questions are now swirling around NATO's future, Russia's reach near America's doorstep, and a widening confrontation with Iran that could push the region into something far more dangerous. And the deeper this crisis goes, the clearer one thing becomes: the old security architecture may be cracking under the weight of a new and much more volatile world. The first shockwave is coming from Washington's own strategic camp. According to Staperi and the Sedeverets, Areninever there's Emirates. Threinaver iftir point Marsham Forasavend. Inhaver to more quadim sir, Hereniver D is the Merbat thank. The idea being floated is not a reform at the margins, it is something much caking shape. The idea being floated is not a reform at the margins. It is something much bigger. A new defense structure built around countries seen as more willing to act militarily, potentially including nations such as Japan, Astrust, and that matters far beyond Brussels. Because alliances are not just paper-rolled, they are sinos cumbles and orniths. They are Batham Olvery Senumrates, they're Enuan of Pro that, and every other challenger whether the West is still politically cohesive enough to absorb a crisis and hit back together. In this case, the criticism appears to be tied to frustration over Allied reluctance to join or support U.S. moves in the confrontation with Iran. Former Trump-era figures, according to the source material, have echoed that frustration and argued that America needs a much broader reassessment of its alliance system. President Donald Trump is always quace against, rather the downs heyots. But the bigger issue is not whether a withdrawal happens tomorrow. The bigger issue is that even the threat of it reshapes calculations today. And while that debate unfolds, another geopolitical pressure point is getting hotter in the Caribbean. A Polish report cited in the source says Russia has effectively tested the limits of the U.S. pressure campaign on Cuba by getting a Russian oil tanker through despite sanctions pressure and earlier warnings from Washington. The report describes the move as a symbolic and strategic win for Moscow, especially because the vessel was expected by some observers to face direct obstruction and did not. The White House, according to the account, has framed the shipment as a one-off humanitarian exception tied to Cuba's severe energy situation, not a change in sanctions policy. But they may be on purport of the story. And not because in geopolitics, exceptions become precedents very quickly. If Russia can sustain an energy deliver if disseminated Rome, we a matter powder de my termine, then Moscow is not just keeping Havana afloat. It is demonstrating relevance in the Western Hemisphere, just miles from the continental United States. Russian voices cited in the report go even further, calling Cuba a strategic outpost for Moscow, not merely another partner state. That alone would be serious. But the consequences could go much further. If this turns into a recurring supply line rather than a single shipment, Washington may suicate of tolerating a water rate. On the one tanker is a test, a regular corridor is a challenge. Now shift to the Gulf, where the military picture appears to be getting darker by the day. The source describes a wave of drone and missile attacks across the region, some attributed to or Iranian-aligned actors, hitting or threatening targets in the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Israel, and maritime lanes tied to global energy flows. According to those reports, debris from intercepted drones caused casualties, fires broke out near fuel infrastructure, and tanker operating in Qatari waters was reportedly struck after missiles were launched from Iran. Crew members were evacuated, but the strategic message was unmistakable. The battlefield is widened, and the Enerbe Brats but that are balled to breathe alf. At the same time, Yemen's Houthis are described as coordinating attacks with Iran and Hezbollah, while Israel says it has carried out targeted strikes against senior figures tied to Iran's Quds Force and its regional networks. If those claims are accurate, then this is no longer just a series of isolated exchanges. This is a multi-theater pressure campaign, one where every missile, every drone, and every tanker incident raises the risk of a wider collision between the United States, Israel, Iran, and multiple proxies spread across the region. And that is where things get even more dangerous. Iranian officials, according to the report, are boasting that U.S. carrier groups have pulled farther from Iranian shores, framing that movement as proof that Washington understands its own vulnerability in the Gulf. U.S. officials, meanwhile, are said to be considering the deployment of another carrier strike group closer to the theater. That means both sides may be sending opposite messages from the same battlefield. Iran wants to show that it can push American power back. Washington wants to show that it can still force into the region. In crisis conditions, that kind of signaling is combustible, because each read movement and an impentapayet. And is kinhe. There's also a deeply troubling allegation in the source involving a reported U.S. strike in southern Iran using the Army's new Precision Strike Missile, or PSM. According to the report, the target area included a sports complex and nearby buildings, and analysts cited by the source claimed the strike may have hit or affected civilian sites, including a school. U.S. officials are said to have acknowledged awareness of the reporting without confirming the details. If confirmed, that would raise serious questions not just about the strike itself, but about the use of emerging battlefield systems in densely populated environments. It would also intensify the propaganda and legitimacy battle already surrounding this conflict, especially as Iran seeks to portray itself as under direct attack by the United States and Israel alike. But the real shockwave may not stop there. The report says Iran's parliament is seriously considering whether to leave the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That is one of the most consequential signals anywhere in this entire crisis, because once a state under military pressure starts questioning its NPT commitments, the conversation is no longer only about retaliation. It becomes a conversation about nuclear thresholds, breakout timelines, and regional chain reactions. Iran is already described as having accumulated a large stockpile of highly enriched uranium. If Tehran legaux, and Washington would be forced into choices it has spent decades trying to avoid. At the same time, President Trump, according to the source, has issued a stark warning. If Iran does not reach an agreement with the United States and does not keep the Strait of Hormuz open, Washington could escalate dramatically against Iran's oil, power, and other critical infrastructure. That is an extraordinary threat because it moves beyond purely military targets and points directly at the arteries of the Iranian state. And once Hormuz enters the equation, the whole world has a stake. This is not a local waterway. It is one of the most important energy choke points on Earth. That is why the report's final military point matters so much. It argues that if the United States ever tries to force the issue militarily around Hormuz, it would have to contend with Iran's defensive island chain and entrenched positions along the maritime corridor. Iranian analysts and commanders have long treated those islands as unsinkable carriers, fixed launch points for missiles, drones, mines, and swarm tactics. In other words, even a stronger U.S. military does not automatically get a clean, low-cost path through that geography. And for Washington, so where does this leave us tonight? With an alliance system under strain, Russia testing American limits near Cuba, Iran and its partners widening the field of conflict, and nuclear risk moving from background concern to frontline strategic reality. The old assumptions are breaking down. The new rules have not been written yet. And in moments like this, history has a way of moving faster than diplomacy. What we are watching now is not just a regional crisis. It is the early shape of a much broader confrontation over who still sets the terms of global order, and how far each side is willing to go before their course.